The post-hole digger hit the dirt with a heavy, satisfying thud, spraying red clay across Bianca's perfectly manicured hydrangeas. She was vibrating with a level of rage I'd previously only seen in feral cats, clutching a laminated HOA rulebook like a holy text. For 3 years, she'd treated my 5-acre lake property as her personal country club, demanding I mow the shoreline to her standards. Today, she was learning a hard lesson in property law, and it was going to cost her half her backyard. The deed to the property was a heavy piece of paper. It felt substantial, real. After 15 years of renting shoebox apartments with paper-thin walls where you could hear the neighbors arguing about the electric bill, I wanted silence. I found it on the outskirts of a rapidly expanding suburb. It was a weird, leftover parcel of land, 5 acres of dense pine, wild blackberry bushes, and a 2-acre natural lake. The old man who owned it before me had lived in a small, rotting cabin on the north end and mostly kept to himself. When he passed, the property sat on the market for months. Developers didn't want it because a natural watershed restriction meant they couldn't drain the lake and build a subdivision. But I didn't want a subdivision. I just wanted the water, the trees, and a quiet place to put a modular home. Directly to the south of my property line sat Oak Ridge Estates. It was one of those aggressively sterile neighborhoods where every house was a shade of grayish, the mailboxes matched, and the lawns were cut to a uniform millimeter. They had built right up to the edge of my property line. In fact, if you looked at a satellite map, the backyards of a dozen Oak Ridge homes abutted my woods. I didn't think much of it. I figured fences make good neighbors, except there were no fences. My first weekend on the property, I was clearing out the rusted debris the previous owner had left behind. I had a pair of heavy leather work gloves on, sweating through a t-shirt, tossing rusted hubcaps into the back of a rented dumpster. That's when I heard the splashing. I wiped the sweat off my forehead with the back of my forearm and walked down the dirt path toward the lake. There, bobbing in the center of my water, was a giant, inflatable pink flamingo. 3 kids were screaming and jumping off it, while 2 adults sat in folding lawn chairs on my shoreline, drinking canned margaritas. I stood there for a minute, processing the scene. They had a cooler, a portable radio playing top 40 hits, a golden retriever shaking wet sand onto the exposed roots of my willow tree. I walked down the slope. The grass crunched under my boots. The man in the chair looked up wearing polarized Oakleys. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked annoyed that I was walking toward him. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone even. "How's it going?" "Good," he said, taking a sip of his drink. He didn't offer a name. "I'm Dave. I just bought this property." The woman next to him lowered her sunglasses. She had tight, highlighted blonde hair and a visor. "Oh, we thought the bank owned it." "Nope. Closed on it Tuesday. It's private property." I waited for the apology. I waited for them to start packing up their cooler. Instead, the woman sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of inconvenience. "Well," she said, "we've been swimming here for 2 years. Old Man Miller never cared." I'm not Old Man Miller," I said, "and I'm assuming liability if someone gets hurt out here. I'm going to have to ask you to pack it up." The man stood up. He wasn't physically intimidating, just soft in the middle with the unearned confidence of someone who has never been punched in the mouth. "Look, buddy, we live right up the hill. We're part of the Oak Ridge HOA. This lake is practically a neighborhood amenity. We keep an eye on it." "It's not an amenity," I said, dropping the friendly tone entirely. "It's my backyard. Please leave." They packed up, but not quietly. The woman muttered loudly about hostile neighbors and ruining the community. I watched them drag their pink flamingo up the hill, cutting straight through the woods, directly into the backyard of one of the large grayish houses. I thought that was the end of it. Oh, just a misunderstanding. People get used to empty land and claim it as their own. It happens. 3 days later, Bianca arrived. I was on a ladder, inspecting the gutters of the modular home that had just been set on its foundation. I heard a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the aluminum siding. I looked down. A woman was standing there. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt, a polo shirt, and carried a thick clipboard. Her expression was a rigid mask of authoritative displeasure. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice didn't ask. It demanded. I climbed down the ladder, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Can I help you?" "I am Bianca Vance," she said, "president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about the state of this lot." I stared at her. "Oak Ridge? That's the neighborhood next door." "We share a property boundary," she corrected, tapping a manicured fingernail against her clipboard. "And frankly, the transition zone is unacceptable. The brush along the southern edge of the lake is overgrown. Furthermore, you denied access to the Thompson family this weekend." "That lake has historically been open for Oak Ridge residents." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The sheer entitlement caught me off guard. "Historically? You mean when you were all trespassing on a dying man's land?" Bianca's mouth formed a thin, bloodless line. "We maintain the view. It is a shared ecosystem. Furthermore, this modular structure," she gestured with utter disgust at my home, "was not submitted for architectural review." "Because I'm not in your HOA, Bianca." "Your property affects our property values," she countered, stepping closer. I could smell her perfume, something sharp and floral that gave me an instant headache. "Oak Ridge has very strict covenants regarding sightlines and nuisance properties. If you intend to live here, you will clear the brush 50 feet from our property line, and you will allow the residents continued access to the water. It is an established easement by prior use." She wasn't asking, she was dictating terms. "Let me make this very simple," I said, leaning closer so she could hear every word. "I am not in your HOA. You have zero authority here. There is no easement. If I see anyone from your neighborhood on my land, I am calling the sheriff for trespassing. Have a great afternoon." I turned my back and climbed up the ladder. I heard her suck in a sharp breath. "You will be hearing from our legal counsel," she barked. I didn't answer. I just started pulling dried leaves out of the gutter. The letter arrived via certified mail 2 weeks later. It was printed on heavy stock paper, with the Oak Ridge Estates logo embossed at the top. It was 3 pages of aggressive legal jargon, citing prescriptive easements, attractive nuisances, and blight. According to Bianca and her board, my failure to mow the weeds around the lake was encouraging pests. My modular home was an eyesore that violated their sightline covenants, and, most hilariously, they claimed that because Oak Ridge residents had used the lake for recreation for over a year without being told to leave, they had established a legal right to continued use. They attached a schedule of fines. They were actually trying to fine me, a non-member, $100 a day for non-compliance. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee, reading the letter. It wasn't legally binding. Any first-year law student could tell you that you can't enforce a private contract, an HOA covenant, on a party that never signed it. But it was a nuisance, and Bianca knew it. She was weaponizing the HOA's legal budget, hoping to bully me into submission, because most people cave when they see a lawyer's letterhead. I didn't cave. I got curious. I took a Tuesday off work and drove down to the county clerk's office. The building was old, smelling of floor wax and stale paper. I asked the clerk to pull the plat maps for my parcel and the Oak Ridge subdivision. I spread the large blue-lined sheets across the viewing table. My property was originally a much larger farm. The developers of Oak Ridge had purchased the southern 80 acres from the original owner decades ago, leaving the 5 acres with the lake intact. I traced the boundaries with my finger. Something didn't look right. I looked at the satellite overlay on the county's digital terminal. Then I looked at the plat map. The developer of Oak Ridge had maximized their lot sizes. They squeezed as many houses as possible against the northern boundary line. To make the premium lake view lots more appealing, they had built the houses close to the street, extending the backyards deep toward my woods. But looking at the exact coordinates on the plat map, the line didn't match the physical reality on the ground. I took out my phone and punched the numbers into a basic GPS mapping tool. It wasn't perfectly accurate, but it was close enough to make my heart beat a little faster. I paid the clerk $50 for certified copies of every map and deed. Then I called a professional surveying company. "I need a boundary survey," I told the dispatcher. "Pin placement, the works. I want every corner of my property line marked with steel and neon tape." They came out 3 days later. Mike, the lead surveyor, was a tall, sunburned guy who looked like he spent his entire life walking through briar patches. He and his assistant dragged their total station and GPS rovers through the brush. I walked with them. We started at the road, found the iron pin buried in the ditch, and worked our way back. As we approached the southern boundary, the line bordering Oak Ridge Estates, Mike stopped. He looked at his data collector, frowned, and looked up at the row of immaculate backyards. "Well," Mike said, scratching his chin, "this is going to be a mess." "What is it?" I asked. He pointed into the yards. "See that line of sod, where the dark green grass meets your weeds?" "Yeah." "That's not the property line." Mike tapped the screen of his device. "The developers platted this out 20 years ago, but they didn't put up fences. These homeowners just started mowing past their lines. They just kept pushing back, claiming the woods, making their yards bigger." "How far back?" I asked. Mike walked past the line of sod. He walked past a stone fire pit. He walked right up to a massive, custom-built cedar pergola with a built-in outdoor kitchen. He drove a wooden stake into the ground right in the middle of a perfectly manicured lawn, about 3 feet away from the pergola's stone pillars. He tied a bright pink ribbon around it. "Right here," Mike said, "your property line extends about 30 feet into what they think is their backyards. For the entire length of the subdivision." I stood there, staring down the line. 6 houses, 6 backyards, 30 feet of encroachment, and the house sitting directly in the middle of the block. The one with the massive cedar pergola, the stone fire pit, and the expensive landscaping. I recognized the patio furniture. I recognized the obnoxious floral smell drifting from the open windows. It was Bianca's house. For years, Bianca had been hosting HOA meetings, drinking wine, and lecturing people about property values while sitting 30 feet inside my property line. Her prized pergola was practically straddling the boundary. Her expensive retaining wall and half her rose garden belonged to me. "Mark it," I told Mike. "Mark every single inch. I want stakes every 10 feet. Mike grinned. "You're gonna start a war, buddy." "I didn't start it," I said. "I'm just drawing the borders." For the next 2 hours, Mike and his crew drove heavy wooden stakes into the ground. Thud, 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 straight through freshly cut Bermuda grass, straight through mulch beds, straight across gravel paths. By the time they were done, it looked like a neon pink dotted line had been drawn right through the heart of Oak Ridge's premium lots. I paid Mike, got the certified survey documents in my hand, and sat on my porch with a cold beer. I didn't have to wait long. At 4:30 p.m., 30 p.m., the sound of a minivan slamming its doors echoed across the water. Then came the screaming. What is the meaning of this? Bianca was marching through the woods, oblivious to the mud getting on her expensive loafers. She was holding one of my pink ribboned stakes in her hand, having violently yanked it out of the ground. She marched right up to my porch, her face flushed a deep, mottled red. "You are vandalizing my property," she shrieked, pointing the dirty stake at me like a weapon. "I have already called the police. You cannot just hammer garbage into my lawn." I took a slow sip of my beer. I felt calm, a deep, settling calm that only comes when you are holding all the cards and the person across from you is playing checkers. "Actually, Bianca, I can," I said, setting the bottle down. "Because that isn't your lawn." "Excuse me." "That stake," I pointed to the piece of wood in her hand, "was placed by a licensed surveyor. It marks the legal boundary of my property. By pulling it out, you just committed a misdemeanor. Destruction of boundary markers." She scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You are insane. My property line ends at the tree line. The developer told us that when we bought the house." "The developer lied to you to sell a premium lot," I said, stepping off the porch. I walked toward her, closing the distance, forcing her to look up at me. "Or you just started mowing into the woods and assumed nobody would stop you. Either way, you are 30 feet onto my land. Your fire pit is on my land. Half your pergola is on my land." "You're lying," she spat, but I could see the first flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I have a deed." "So do I, and a certified survey, which you just tampered with." Right on cue, a white SUV with the county sheriff's logo rolled slowly down my dirt driveway. Bianca had actually called them. She turned, her face lighting up with vicious triumph. "Perfect," she said. "You're going to jail for vandalism." Two deputies stepped out. One was older, looking incredibly tired of suburban disputes. The other was young, hand resting casually on his belt. "All right," the older deputy sighed. "Who called?" "I did, officer," Bianca said, her voice instantly dropping an octave to sound sweet and victimized. "This man who has been terrorizing our neighborhood came onto my property and hammered these wooden stakes into my landscaping. He's trying to claim my yard as his own." The deputy looked at me. "That true?" "No, sir," I said. I handed the deputy the thick manila envelope containing the certified survey, the plat maps, and the deed. "I had a licensed boundary survey done today. The stakes indicate the legal property line. The woman holding the stake in her hand just ripped it out of the ground, which I believe is a violation of state code." The deputy took the envelope, pulled out the map, and looked at it. He looked at the map, looked across the lake toward the row of houses. He traced the lines with a thick finger. "Ma'am," the deputy said, looking at Bianca, "did you pull this stake out of the ground?" "It was in my yard," she yelled, her victim act slipping instantly. "According to this survey, ma'am, it wasn't. Now this is a civil matter regarding the boundary, but pulling up surveyor stakes is against the law. I suggest you put it exactly back where you found it." Bianca looked like she was going to have a stroke. Her mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "This is a forged document. He printed this in his basement." "It has the county seal right here, ma'am," the deputy pointed out, losing his patience. "Look, I'm not a judge. If you dispute the line, hire your own surveyor. But until then, do not touch the markers. And sir," he looked at me, "keep the peace." "I plan to," I said. "I'm just going to build a fence." The deputies left. Bianca stood there, trembling with rage. She threw the stake on the ground at my feet. "You'll not build a fence?" she hissed. "The HOA has strict regulations on fencing materials and heights." "Oh, we will deny your application." I couldn't help it. I smiled. A big, teeth-baring smile. "Bianca, I am not in the HOA. Your rules do not apply to me. I can build whatever I want, however I want, right on the property line. And I'm going to." I walked back to my porch, leaving her standing in the mud. The next morning I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the county permit office to ensure there were no restrictions on agricultural fencing in my zoning. There weren't. I could build up to 8 feet without a variance. The second call was to a commercial fencing contractor. I didn't want a nice, polite white picket fence. I didn't want friendly chain link. I ordered 6-foot-tall, solid wood, pressure-treated privacy panels. The kind they put around industrial yards to block out noise and sight. Ugly, heavy, and impenetrable. I need it expedited, I told the contractor over the phone, and it needs to be set exactly on the surveyed pin line, down to the millimeter. "We can start Monday," he said. "It's a straight run, easy money." The third call was to my lawyer. I had him draft a formal letter of eviction for the 6 homeowners encroaching on my land. They had 30 days to remove all personal property, including fire pits, sheds, and pergolas, from my side of the survey line, or I would demolish them during the fence installation. The weekend before the fence company arrived was chaotic. The pink ribbons fluttering in the wind had sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge Estates. My phone started blowing up. Bianca had apparently distributed my number. I got angry voicemails from the Thompson family, the ones with the flamingo, demanding I compromise. I got a tearful call from an older woman 2 houses down, begging me not to cut off her garden. I didn't answer. I didn't negotiate. Bianca, true to her nature, escalated. She rallied the HOA board. They hired a lawyer who sent me an emergency injunction, claiming adverse possession, a legal loophole where if you occupy someone else's land, openly and notoriously for a certain number of years, you can claim it. I forwarded it to my lawyer. He called me 10 minutes later, laughing. "They don't have a case," he said. "In this state, adverse possession takes 20 years of continuous use, and you have to have been paying the property taxes on the disputed land. They've been paying taxes on their platted lot sizes, not your land. The injunction is a bluff. So I can build." "Build the wall, Dave," my lawyer said. Monday morning at 7 a.m., the heavy machinery arrived. 3 large flatbed trucks rumbled down my dirt driveway, loaded with stacks of thick, raw lumber and pallets of concrete mix. A skid steer with a massive hydraulic auger rolled off the trailer, its tracks chewing into the earth. I walked out with a thermos of coffee to meet the foreman, a burly guy named Hector. "Line is marked," I told Hector, pointing to the stakes. "Do not deviate." Hector looked across the line. He saw the manicured lawns. He saw the stone fire pit right in the path. He saw the edge of Bianca's pergola, its heavy cedar support post sitting exactly 1 foot inside my property line. "Boss," Hector said, scratching his hard hat, "there's structures in the way." "The notice to remove expired at midnight," I said. "Whatever is on my side of the line, take it down." Hector grinned. "You got it." The skid steer roared to life. The noise woke up the neighborhood. By the time the auger started drilling the first post hole, tossing up mounds of dark earth, doors were flying open. Bianca came sprinting out of her back door in her bathrobe, screaming so loud I could hear her over the diesel engine. "Stop! Stop immediately!" She ran straight toward the skid steer, forcing Hector to cut the engine. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her hair wild, her face pale. "Our lawyer sent you an injunction." "Injunction denied," I yelled back, walking toward her. "You are trespassing on a construction site, Bianca. Move, or I'm calling the deputies back." "That fence will block my lake view," she cried, looking at the towering stacks of solid wood panels. "You never had a lake view," I said coldly. "You had a stolen view from stolen land. Now get back on your side of the line." Hector fired the engine back up. Bianca scrambled back as the auger dropped right into the middle of her prized rose bed. The machine chewed through the dirt, severing roots and sending mulch flying. She stood on her patio, weeping in fury as we began to physically carve her kingdom in half. Hector didn't hesitate. He was a man who got paid by the linear foot, and emotional homeowners weren't on his payroll. He climbed out of the skid steer and grabbed a heavy-style chainsaw from the bed of his truck. He walked up to the edge of Bianca's custom cedar pergola. The massive 8x8 support pillar was sitting exactly 16 inches across the pink neon line, rooted firmly in my soil. Bianca was hyperventilating on her patio, clutching her phone to her ear. She was screaming at some poor dispatcher, demanding SWAT, the National Guard, anyone who would listen. Hector pulled the cord. The chainsaw roared, a vicious two-stroke snarl that drowned out her yelling. He stepped up to the cedar pillar. He didn't cut the whole thing down. He was a professional. He simply made a vertical plunge cut, slicing right down the survey line. Sawdust sprayed like a geyser. The smell of fresh-cut cedar filled the humid morning air, sweet and sharp. It took him less than 3 minutes. He kicked the severed chunk of wood with his heavy work boot. It tumbled into my weeds. The pergola groaned, the roof sagging heavily on that corner, now unsupported on the encroaching side. Bianca dropped her phone. She literally fell to her knees on her stamped concrete patio, her hands covering her mouth. It wasn't just wood to her. It was status. It was the illusion of her expansive, wealthy estate being amputated right in front of her. I felt a twinge of something, not guilt, pity maybe. It is a pathetic thing to watch someone's entire world view shatter over a patch of dirt. But then I remembered her standing in my yard, dictating what I could and couldn't do with my own home, trying to find me into submission. The pity evaporated. The crew moved methodically. Down the line they went. Thud. Drill. Set. When they reached the Thompsons' house, the folks with the inflatable flamingo, they ran into a massive, built-in, stone fire pit. Half of it was over the line. Hector's crew brought out the sledgehammers. I sat on my porch and watched the demolition. The sharp crack of steel hitting masonry echoed across the lake. The Thompsons stood in their kitchen window, watching their $2,000 weekend project crumble into uneven rubble. By noon, the posts were set in concrete, a perfectly straight line of 4x4 treated lumber stretching across the back of 6 properties. At 1:52 p.m., they started nailing the panels. Or these weren't decorative slatted panels that let the breeze through. These were solid, zero-gap privacy boards, a full 6 feet high. The wood was raw, chemically treated and ugly as sin. It was a barricade. Panel by panel, the view disappeared. I watched Bianca's house vanish. First the foundation, then the patio windows, then the sagging roof of her pergola. The physical separation was jarring. 1 minute I was looking into the manicured, exposed underbelly of suburbia. The next, I was looking at a blank wooden wall. The psychological effect on the Oak Ridge side must have been suffocating. For years they had looked out their back windows and seen 5 acres of sprawling nature, a private lake, and towering pines. It made their lots feel immense. Now they looked out their windows and saw a 6-foot wall of cheap, pressure-treated pine, exactly 20 feet from their back doors. Their yards had been visually and physically halved. They were boxed in, trapped in the very cookie-cutter boundaries they had tried to escape by stealing my land. By 5:02 p.m., Hector and his crew were packing up. The wall was finished. I walked the length of it. It was completely silent on my side. The noise of lawn mowers, the barking of designer dogs, the ambient hum of suburban entitlement. It was all muffled, choked out by the heavy wood. I took a deep breath. The air smelled like dirt, pine needles, and lake water. Peace, finally. Or so I thought. You can build a wall to keep people out, but you can't fence out a bruised ego. Bianca had lost the physical turf war, so she shifted to a bureaucratic insurgency. It started on a Tuesday. I was drinking my morning coffee when a white Ford F-150 with municipal plates rolled down my driveway. A guy in a high-visibility vest got out holding a tablet. "County Health Department," he announced as I walked out. "Got a complaint about stagnant water and a severe mosquito breeding hazard on this parcel." I sighed. "Let me guess, Bianca at Oak Ridge Estates." He didn't confirm or deny it, just tapped his screen. "I need to inspect the shoreline." I walked him down to the lake. The water was clear. Frogs were croaking in the reeds. Bluegills darted around the shallows. The inspector stopped and looked around. He kicked a clump of dirt. "This is a natural, spring-fed lake. The water's moving." "I know. There's fish in here. Fish eat mosquito larvae." "I know." He sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "The complaint said you had tires and open barrels collecting sludge. I have to write up the report, but you're fine. Sorry for the bother." 3 days later, it was a building inspector. Bianca had filed a complaint claiming my modular home was improperly anchored and violated safety codes. The inspector spent an hour crawling under my house, checking the tie-downs. He found nothing, apologized for the intrusion, and left. The following week, it was the EPA. Someone had anonymously reported me for dumping motor oil into the watershed. That one actually scared me. Federal fines are no joke. An agent in a windbreaker spent 3 hours taking soil and water samples. He found 0 trace of hydrocarbons. It was a war of attrition. Bianca was using taxpayer resources to harass me, hoping the sheer stress of constant inspections would break me. It was exhausting. Every time I heard tires crunching on my gravel driveway, my chest tightened. I started sleeping less. I found myself pacing the house at night, staring at the long, dark line of the fence out my window. She was bleeding my peace of mind. Then came the lights. Oak Ridge Estates sat on a slight elevation above my property. One night, around 11 p.m., my bedroom suddenly lit up like a prison yard. I shot out of bed, heart hammering. I went to the window. Bianca had installed commercial-grade LED floodlights on the back of her house. Because of the elevation, they cleared my 6-foot fence perfectly. They were angled directly down into my property, blasting my bedroom windows with thousands of lumens of harsh, blinding white light. I walked out to my porch in the dark. The glare was painful. I could hear the faint, smug sound of a television playing from her open back window. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. The same tired deputy from the stake incident came out. He stood on my porch, shielding his eyes from the glare. "It's a nuisance," I told him. "It's light trespass." The deputy shook his head. "Dave, I agree with you, it's petty as hell. But there's no county ordinance against bright security lights. She claims she feels unsafe because of the blind spot the fence created. I can't force her to turn them off. It's a civil matter." He drove away. I stood in the artificial daylight, squinting at the fence. I realized then that playing defense was a losing strategy. Bianca would never stop. She had nothing but free time, HOA funds, and a bottomless well of vindictiveness. If I kept deflecting, she would just keep swinging until she landed a hit. I needed to go on the offense, but it had to be legal. It had to be untouchable. I spent the next morning researching local zoning ordinances. My 5-acre parcel was originally part of an old farm. When the county rezoned the area to accommodate the suburban sprawl of Oak Ridge, my specific parcel had been grandfathered in under an ag-res designation. Hey, agricultural residential. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. I picked up the phone and called a local commercial dairy farm about 20 miles out of town. "Hey," I said to the farmer who answered, "do you guys sell raw, uncomposted cow manure?" "Sure do," he said. "Usually sell it by the cubic yard to commercial nurseries. Stuff's hot, though. Needs to sit a long time before you put it on delicate plants." "I don't have delicate plants," I said. "I'm doing some bulk soil remediation. How much to deliver a dump truck full?" "A whole dump truck," he whistled. "Gonna smell like the devil's own outhouse." "Hey, that's exactly what I'm going for. Can you drop it tomorrow?" The next afternoon, a massive 10-wheel dump truck backed slowly down my driveway. I met the driver and pointed toward the fence line. "Right there," I said. Dead center. Dead center was exactly behind Bianca's patio. The truck raised its hydraulic bed. A mountain of steaming, dark, wet, uncomposted cow manure slid out, hitting the ground with a wet, squelching thud. It piled up, 4 feet high, running for about 20 feet right along the property line. The smell hit me instantly. It was a physical wall of odor, ammonia, rot, and deep, earthy decay. It was breathtakingly awful. The driver rolled down his window, holding his breath. "Good luck with your tomatoes, buddy," he yelled before speeding off. I put on a heavy respirator mask, grabbed a pitchfork, and spent the next hour spreading the pile out, maximizing its surface area. I brought it right up to the wood of the fence. It was mid-August. The temperature was 92 degrees with 90% humidity. The sun baked the raw manure, essentially cooking it, lifting the invisible, toxic vapor right over the fence and directly onto Bianca's stamped concrete patio. I went inside, sealed my windows, and turned my AC on full blast. 2 hours later, the screaming started. I walked out to my front porch, safely upwind of the pile. I could hear Bianca hacking and gagging from her side of the fence. "What is that? Oh my God, I'm going to vomit." I heard doors slamming. I heard the Thompson family next door yelling. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was the HOA's lawyer. I let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, the sheriff arrived again. The tired deputy walked out of his cruiser, took one breath, and visibly gagged, pulling his uniform collar up over his nose. He walked up to my porch, his eyes watering. "Dave," he wheezed, "well, what did you do?" "Agricultural soil remediation," I said, holding up a copy of my zoning classification. "I'm well within my ag-res rights to utilize organic fertilizer on my property, preparing the soil for a future orchard." The deputy looked at the paper. He looked at the steaming pile of waste pressed against the fence. He looked up at the blinding LED floodlights still bolted to Bianca's house. He started to laugh. It was a choked, coughing laugh, but he couldn't stop. "God almighty," he said, wiping his eyes. "You know she's calling the EPA, the health department, and the governor over this, right?" "Let her," I said. "It's legal fertilizer. The smell is just a byproduct of nature." The deputy handed the paper back to me. "I'll tell them there's no crime being committed, just basic farming." He retreated to his cruiser as fast as he could. That night, for the first time in weeks, the blinding LED floodlights on Bianca's house clicked off. The stench was so thick they couldn't even leave the back windows open to vent the heat. They were sealed inside their grayish fortress, prisoners of their own making. I slept like a baby. The manure pile became a local legend. For 3 weeks, the August heat baked the raw cow waste into a crusty, foul-smelling monument to property rights. The wind, which historically blew gently from the lake up the hill toward Oak Ridge Estates, did the heavy lifting. It carried the stench directly over the 6-foot wooden barricade, infiltrating the vents, the expensive outdoor kitchens, and the pristine, air-conditioned living rooms of my neighbors. Bianca threw everything she had at me. The county health inspector returned, this time looking distinctly apologetic, forced by standard operating procedure to investigate a formal complaint of bioterrorism. He took one look at my freshly planted row of sapling apple trees, purchased from a local nursery for $20 apiece to legitimize my orchard, and signed off on the paperwork. The EPA agent didn't even bother driving out. He just called me, sighed into the receiver, and asked if I planned on turning the pile soon. I told him I'd get to it when the soil was ready. The bureaucratic machine had stalled out. Bianca couldn't legislate me into submission, and she couldn't outspend me on lawyers because I wasn't fighting her in court. I was just farming my own dirt. But a funny thing happens when a tyrant loses a war. The people they rule over start to notice the armor is dented. It happened on a humid Thursday evening. I was sitting on my porch, cleaning a cast-iron skillet, when I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of a fist pounding on my front gate. I had installed a heavy steel farm gate at the top of the driveway after the fence went up, wrapping it in heavy chain and a padlock. I set the skillet down and walked up the gravel path. Standing on the other side of the gate was Thompson, the flamingo guy, the one who had lost half his stone fire pit to Hector's chainsaw. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked exhausted. He was wearing gym shorts and a stained t-shirt, swatting at a mosquito on his neck. "Dave," he said. It was the first time he'd used my name without a sneer. "Thompson," I replied, keeping my hands resting loosely on the steel bar of the gate. I didn't unlock it. He stared at the padlock, then looked up at me. "Can we talk?" "We're talking." He let out a long, ragged breath. "Look, my wife is threatening to take the kids to her mother's in Connecticut. The smell. We can't eat dinner. We can't open the windows. We had to cancel our daughter's birthday party. We're suffocating back there." "Fee, I'm prepping the soil for an orchard," I said, my voice deadpan. "Agriculture is a messy business." Thompson rubbed his eyes. The fight was completely gone from him. "I know what you're doing. Everyone knows what you're doing. You proved your point. You got your land back. We get it." "Do you?" "Yes." He looked genuinely miserable. "We were wrong. We assumed the land was ours. We pushed the boundaries. We were jerks about the lake." An apology, a real, unvarnished apology. It felt strange to hear it out loud in this neighborhood of hyperinflated egos. "It's not just the smell," Thompson continued, leaning closer to the gate, lowering his voice. "It's Bianca. She's gone completely off the deep end." "More than usual." Thompson let out a bitter bark of a laugh. "She's draining the HOA reserve fund. She hired a new litigation firm out of the city, billed the association 10 grand just for a retainer to draft a nuisance lawsuit against you. When the board pushed back, she threatened to fine us all for failure to maintain community standards. She's auditing everyone's yard to find petty violations so she can drum up cash to fight you." I stayed silent. "Let him talk." "She fined a guy 3 streets over because his mailbox was a shade of gray that wasn't pre-approved," Thompson said, shaking his head. "She's patrolling the sidewalks at midnight with a flashlight. She's unhinged, Dave. The whole neighborhood is turning into a police state because she can't handle the fact that she lost her pergola." "Sounds like an internal Oak Ridge problem," I said gently. "I'm not in your HOA." "We're holding an emergency board meeting on Tuesday," Thompson said, looking me dead in the eye. "A vote of no confidence. We're going to recall her as president." I raised an eyebrow. "Good luck with that. She doesn't strike me as the type to surrender power quietly." "She won't," he admitted. "But if we get her out, the lawsuit drops, the harassment stops, the floodlights come down." He paused, swallowing hard. "If we do that, if we oust her, will you move the pile? Just push it away from the fence line, please." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was a guy who had bought into the suburban dream, followed the leader, and ended up with a shattered fire pit and a yard that smelled like a slaughterhouse. "Tuesday night," I said. "Tuesday night," Thompson confirmed. "If she's no longer president on Wednesday morning," I said, "I'll rent the skid steer and move the compost to the north end of the property." "But Thompson." "Yeah, if she stays in power, I'm buying a second truckload, and I'm going to start raising pigs." His eyes went wide. He nodded frantically, backed away from the gate, and practically sprinted up the hill. Tuesday night came. I sat on my porch, drinking a cold beer, listening to the crickets. Through the dense wood of the fence, I couldn't see the Oak Ridge clubhouse, but I could imagine the scene. A room full of angry, sleep-deprived homeowners, holding a mutiny against a woman, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. At 9:30 p.m. my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She's out. Unanimous vote. I smiled in the dark, took a slow sip of my beer, and typed back. Skid steer arrives Thursday. I thought it was over. I really did. I underestimated the sheer, terrifying velocity of a narcissist in free fall. Wednesday morning was quiet. Eerily quiet. The blinding floodlights on Bianca's house had finally been switched off the night before, likely by the Thompsons or someone else pulling her breaker. I went to work. I came home around 6:00 p.m. The sun was sitting low over the lake, casting long golden shadows through the pines. I walked down toward the fence line to inspect the manure pile, planning my excavation route for the morning. Something was wrong. The pile had been disturbed. It wasn't just settled by the wind and rain. Someone had taken a shovel to it. Big, ragged chunks of the crust had been hacked away and tossed aside. I frowned, stepping closer. The smell, which had dulled over the past week as a dry crust formed, was suddenly raw and biting again. I looked at the fence. Right where the massive cedar post of Bianca's pergola used to sit, there was a gap. Someone had taken a crowbar and violently pried two of the heavy 6-foot wooden panels completely off the structural rails. The raw nails were bent and jutting out aggressively. I stepped through the gap. Bianca's yard was a disaster zone. The perfectly manicured lawn was rutted with deep, muddy gouges, and there, smeared across her stamped concrete patio, her expensive sliding glass doors, and the white siding of her house, was the manure. It hadn't been thrown. It had been methodically, maniacally painted onto the house. I stood there, frozen. Suddenly, the sliding glass door slid open on its track. Bianca stepped out. She looked entirely feral. She was wearing dirty sweatpants and a stained blouse. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a rat's nest, matted to her forehead with sweat. Her hands were caked in dark, foul-smelling mud. She looked at me through the gap in the fence. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red, completely devoid of the smug, authoritative shine she used to weaponize. "You ruined it," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken. "You ruined my home." Bianca," I said slowly, taking a step back through the gap, keeping my hands visible. "Did you pry my fence open?" "They took my presidency," she said, ignoring my question. She took a step toward me. She was trembling, a violent, full-body shake. "They humiliated me, in front of everyone. Thompson called me a tyrant. The people I protected, the people I kept safe from trash, like you." "Bianca, you need to step back," I said. "You're trespassing again." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She bent down, grabbed a handful of the wet, raw compost that she had dragged onto her own patio, and hurled it at the fence. It hit the wood with a wet smack. "It's my yard!" she screamed, her voice cracking, echoing across the silent lake. "It was my yard. It was my view. You took my view." She lunged toward the gap in the fence. She wasn't holding a weapon, just her bare, filthy hands, but the pure, unadulterated madness in her eyes made my stomach drop. "Stay right there," I barked, a command born of adrenaline. She hit the gap in the fence and stopped. She didn't cross the property line. She just gripped the splintered edge of the remaining wood panel, her knuckles white, breathing heavily through her mouth. We stared at each other for a long, heavy moment. The crickets had stopped chirping. The air felt thick and electric. "You're going to pay for this," she hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I am going to burn that cheap, ugly house of yours to the ground. I am going to salt the earth. You will never have a moment of peace. Never." She let go of the wood, turned around, and walked back into her house, sliding the glass door shut behind her, smearing more manure onto the handle. I didn't wait. I walked straight to my truck, drove up the hill, and called the sheriff's office on the way. "I need a deputy at my property immediately," I told the dispatcher. "My neighbor just vandalized my fence, trespassed, and made a direct, credible threat to commit arson." This time it wasn't the tired older deputy. It was 2 squad cars, lights flashing, gravel kicking up as they sped down the driveway. I showed them the pried-off fence panels. I showed them the manure she had dragged into her own yard in a fit of absolute psychosis. And I told them exactly what she said. "Did you get it on camera?" the younger deputy asked, hand on his radio. "I don't have cameras on the fence," I said. "But look at her hands. Look at her door. She did it." The deputies walked through the gap in the fence. They knocked on the sliding glass door. They knocked on the front door. Bianca didn't answer. They ran her plates. They checked the perimeter. Finally, they had to call a magistrate to get an emergency warrant based on the arson threat and the visible vandalism. It took 2 hours. By 9 p.m., a small crowd had gathered on the Oak Ridge side of the street. Thompson was there, standing on his driveway with his arms crossed, watching the flashing blue and red lights bounce off the grayish siding of the houses. When the deputies finally breached the front door, it was anticlimactic. There was no screaming, no grand final stand. 10 minutes later, they walked Bianca out the front door in handcuffs. She looked completely vacant. The manic energy had burned itself out, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a suburban dictator. She didn't look at the neighbors. She didn't look at me. She just stared blankly at the asphalt as the deputy guided her into the back of the cruiser. I stood by my ruined fence and watched the taillights fade into the night. The next morning, the skid steer arrived. True to my word, I scooped up the mountain of compost and relocated it to the far north end of my property, deep in the woods, leaving the fence line clean. Hector's crew came out that afternoon and bolted the fence panels back into place, securing them with heavy, tamper-proof carriage bolts. 3 days later, Bianca was released on bail, facing charges for vandalism and terroristic threats. A judge granted me a temporary restraining order, mandating she stay 100 yards away from me and my property line. Given that her house was 20 feet from the line, she legally couldn't go back home. A week after that, a bright red "for sale" sign went up in her front yard. She never came back. A moving company packed up her life in boxes over a single weekend. The house sold fast. It was a hot market, and despite the missing pergola, it was a nice property. The new owners were a young couple who had no idea about the property line dispute, the manure, or the war that had been fought over the very dirt they were buying. When they moved in, I walked to the fence, stood on a bucket, and peered over. The young man was setting up a small charcoal grill on the patio. He looked up, startled to see a face looking over the barricade. "Hey," I said. He blinked. Hi. I'm Dave. I live next door." "Oh, nice to meet you. I'm Mark." He gestured awkwardly to the massive wooden wall between us. "Intense fence. It keeps the peace," I said. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I stepped down from the bucket and walked back toward my house. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the deep blue of the sky. The frogs were croaking in the reeds. A cool breeze drifted through the pine trees, carrying the scent of fresh water and damp earth. I sat on my porch, poured a cup of black coffee, and listened to the absolute, uninterrupted silence. It cost me a few $1,000s in survey fees, fencing, and raw cow manure, but as I looked out over my property, I knew it was worth every penny. Because peace, true peace, is rarely given. Sometimes you just have to build a wall and claim it yourself. If you loved watching this entitled HOA tyrant get exactly what she deserved, smash that like button and let me know in the comments how you would have handled her. Sometimes good fences don't just make good neighbors, they completely break the bad ones. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the most satisfying neighborhood drama on the internet. Share this video with a friend who is currently suffering under the iron fist of their own local board, and stick around, because the petty revenge is just getting started. See you next time.